everyone. So this talk is maybe going to be a little bit different because my background is on the biomedical engineering side. So I'm neither really a software developer nor have I been trained as an expert in data science or machine learning. However, I joined IBM I think about 3 years ago, and so that's the research division of IBM, and we started looking into what we can do for epilepsy patients, and so this talk is about all the things we did, and it's maybe a little bit similar also to the previous talk, and so far that it's been a little bit of a journey where we made assumptions, and not all of them were correct in the end. So to start off, many of you might be familiar with what epilepsy is. It's a neurological condition. It affects about 1% of the population, and it's a disease that causes infrequent but unpredictable recurring seizures in patients. The epilepsy as a disease goes together with, or goes along with the increased risk of not only death but also mental illness, stigma, discrimination, and I guess the worst part is that while we have medication, not all patients can be treated adequately with medication. And so a lot of the patients tell us that one thing that's particularly, I guess, devastating for them is that those seizures seem to occur at unpredictable times. So you can imagine that if you don't know if you're going to have a seizure, you never know whether it's advisable if you go and take a shower right now or if you go on a bike ride. And so that's basically where we thought we might come in. So we wanted to find a way to help with that. Now my favorite question is, do we actually need AI for that? And as we've seen in the previous talk, there is often times where general like machine learning models are quite good, or where what we have in place already is working reasonably well. So let's look at what people do at the moment. That's an open source image of a patient wearing an EEG cap. What all these electrodes that you see on the head are doing is they record the electrical activity that the brain emits. And you see on the side those little lines, each of them represents the area underneath one of those electrodes. And you can see how the signal, which is a voltage recording, looks quite different in those 4 segments. That one's eye movement. This one is simply a bad connection of one of the electrodes. In this one you can see someone who's swallowing. And that one's actually one type of seizure. So the way we diagnose epilepsy at the moment is that a neurologist goes and looks at both of these brain signals while someone is wearing this cap, and also looks at a video of a patient. And so if they see either the signal change or they see a change in behavior, or like ideally both, they conclude that this patient has epilepsy. One thing that you can see is you can see that the signal is already quite different between where there is a seizure and where there's not a seizure, but maybe it's not so obvious to see whether it's a seizure or someone's just repeatedly swallowing. But clinicians are quite good at that. However, diagnosis is not quite the same as prediction, and so we were interested in predicting seizures and trying to solve this problem of unpredictability for patients. And by the way, the diagnosis also could use some AI, because at the moment it's people doing it. And that can be a little bit tedious. And so in fact it takes, I think a neurologist gets paid for about 4 hours to look at 24 hours of this brain signal. So any way we can go and aiding them in already maybe filtering out half of it and say, okay, like this definitely has not a seizure in it, that would relieve them of a lot of work. So our task that we set us was not to, as I said, discriminate between seizure and not seizure, but predict a seizure. In order for us to be able to do that, we had patient data collected not with a cap that we just saw, but basically electrodes that are implanted, and they sit right on the surface of the brain to decrease the signal to noise ratio and to give us a little bit of a better signal. That's more or less cartoon of, actually parts of that are real data, but more or less cartoon of what this seizure signal could look like. The data that we got was labeled by experts, so we're dealing with a supervised learning problem here. So we know what a seizure looks like. However, for predicting, we really want to know what the difference is between this blue signal, which is just before a seizure, and everything else. So we've got hours and hours and hours of wide normal brain activity, and then we have a little bit of the signal that basically leads up to someone having a seizure. So we don't really know if there is anything in there yet. We can't just look at that. Neurologists can't just look at that and go like, okay, so in the next 15 minutes you're going to have a seizure because your brain signal is kind of building up to that. So that's the problem statement. And now our approach that more or less started as a well-defined idea of like, this is the difference that we want to spot. And here are all the machine learning tools that we have, and we actually do have machine learning experts as well. And it turned into more of a journey of assumptions and corrections of those. Some of our assumptions. Nothing is better than more data, and I think we've all heard that a lot. It's like the more data we have, the more sources of data we have, the more patients we have, the better this is, the better our model will become. Another thing that we think is there is a clear pattern of what a seizure looks like, what building up to a seizure looks like. And that will be similar across patients and also won't change over time, because why would it? And our goal is to maximize sensitivity, so we actually want to spot every seizure in time and before a seizure happens. I'm just going to keep them here. And we split our problem up into pre-processing, then the network or the machine learning part, post-processing, which is important, and then also the evaluation and seeing if we're doing a good job or not. Pre-processing, that's the same little bit of data. We've got 16 channels of this electromagnetic data. Now what we know from literature is that an epileptic seizure, as I said, it happens in the brain. It's the brain signal changing, and basically that change spreading over your brain, and it often goes along with some sort of change in synchronization. And the synchronization or synchronous activity is something that we might already know from audio signals. And a good way of looking at audio signals is spectrograms, which is a representation of which frequencies occur over the time of the signal. So basically, if in here we would see like a little a line, it would be one frequency or like one tone. And so what we're looking for more or less is like blobs that appear and disappear in this very, very noisy signal. Now we know that neural nets are very good at looking at noisy signals, and we know that they've been made really, really good to look at images. So that's another reason we converted everything into images, into these spectrogram representations. Now seizures have also shown to follow circadian rhythm, so they change for patients. You might have seizures, for example, or always in the morning, or predominantly in the morning, or predominantly in the night. And so these are two histograms of when two particular patients had their seizures. So this first patient had their seizures around 6 a.m., I think, and the second patient, the data on the right, they have seizures at two different times of the day, which already kind of means that one of our assumptions wasn't correct. So this isn't necessarily the same across patients, and we have this additional data source, which is like when does this particular patient happen to have seizures? And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to use that information as well, and use that in combination with our brain signals. And we ended up taking this for each sample that came in, for each sample that was a seizure or wasn't a seizure, pre-seizure or wasn't a seizure. We knew when exactly that had happened, and so we ended up representing that in a 2D image, just simply labeling one little spot that corresponds to that time of day, and we put that in our stack of, where is it? Of our stack of images that we then feed into our neural network. So the next step is, which neural network did we use? We used a convolutional neural network. That's what it looks like. I'm not want to go into any great detail, Basically, as I said, what it's trying to do is it's trying to find those areas in images that are the same for pre-seizure signals, and how they are different between the pre-seizure and the normal brain signal. And it also uses that additional little bit of data, which is the time of day that this patient has had in the past seizures. All right, so now we've got our data. We've got one of these networks, or one of these input stacks at least, specific per patient. So we also train for each patient individually now, because each patient's signals are different. And the next thing that we thought, more data is better. So with moving testing period, we assumed that more data was going to come in. So all that data is historical, but in order to not cheat, we pretended that we're getting it in real time. And so we take all that data and we measure the sensitivity, and we end up with this curve. And it's not entirely obvious in this plot. And there's a little bit more data that I can't show because it's not published yet. But what you can see a little bit is that the performance, instead of increasing, it decreases over time. So it actually gets worse with more data, which is a little bit counterintuitive. Now we tried another thing where we kept the training data as close to the testing data as we could, to be more representative of that specific sample that we're testing, and that was all over the place. But at least for some points in time, we get actually better results doing that than the other one. And then we did more smart things that, again, aren't published yet, but that help us keep the performance better than what we would have if we have more data. So in our case, more data is not better. The reason for that is that we're dealing with human signals, so we're dealing with biological signals. We go through our lives, things change, brain chemistry changes. The epilepsy itself might have an impact on what brain patterns look like, which is not something that we know. The interface between the electrodes and the brain, the changes might occur there, and so all of these things we need to take into account when we train our model. Okay, this also means that it's not just that more is better, but also they change over time. So we need to be aware of where our training and testing data are kind of the same, or closely related. Okay, but there's the last one, and we know that we want to maximize sensitivity because we want to get seizures. So with our network, we now get one sample every 30 seconds, because that's the window that we make our spectrograms over, and we get negative samples, which is these little round circles, and we get positive samples, which means I think a seizure is coming up from the perspective of the network. Now, giving that information directly to patients makes little sense. Our goal was to basically have a little alarm system that says maybe don't take a shower now. But having, I guess, an LED that flickers every 30 seconds, like, hey, seizure, maybe not. Oh, no, I think, no, false alarm. So we needed some additional layer behind that, and that's where the post-processing comes in. So basically what we want to do is some sort of temporal averaging, and saying, like, only if there is a number of positive predictions, we think that you might have a seizure, or might be going towards a seizure. So again, inspired by, I don't know, brain science, we have something that's called a leaky integrated fire neuron, and it's really just doing what I just said. So it's temporal averaging. The moment I cross a threshold, I kick off, or I trigger the alarm. I reset my my counting variable back to baseline, and then I start counting up with every positive prediction again, and do like a temporal averaging again. And so each of these points where my green line hits that threshold is where we set off an alarm, which kind of looks like this, and also gets us into how we now evaluate that. We've got a false negative at the start, a false positive right after that, and then we've got two true positives where the actual seizure or the pre-seizure bit falls into the window that we are setting an alarm of. And so that's what we wanted to measure. So we've got a sensitivity which is a true positive divided by all the seizures. And we also have that variable, which is time and warning, which is something that I guess we normally don't think about, but is intuitive for patients and for clinicians. It's like how long do I spend over the course of the day worrying that I might going to have a seizure? So what we want to do is we want to minimize the time and warning and maximize the sensitivity at the same time. So we're not just maximizing the sensitivity. If we were to do that, we would always turn it on, we would catch every seizure, but also we wouldn't be doing anything useful. So the ideal spot is 0 time and warning, close to 0 time and warning, and a high sensitivity. We have a few variables that we can play with in this post-processing layout. How high do we put the threshold? How long do we make our alarms? If I set it off, again, like for several hours, I might be catching more seizures, but then also there's a higher burden on the patient of having to be in this constant alert state. And then also how quickly does our variable decay and go back to baseline. And so playing with these 3 variables, we get into this space between time and warning and sensitivity. And what we're measuring now is not just the sensitivity, but we're measuring how much better than a random predictor are we. So if we turn it on 0% of the time, we're not going to be better than chance. If we turn it on, if we get 0 sensitivity, if we turn 100% of the time and we get 100% sensitivity, we're obviously also not better than chance. And so what we measured was this little bit from the diagonal line to the dot I have, and updating that in real time as well. One additional little thing that allows us to do is that if we imagine stretching one of these axes, so if you stretch the sensitivity axis and then you still optimize in that space, you can say that sensitivity is actually more important than your time and warning, and that carries a higher weight than the time and warning. So if you imagine 2 scenarios, one where you're active during the day, you want to make a decision on whether you want to go on a bike ride or not, you might prefer that your sensitivity is much higher. Whereas if you, you're trying to sleep and you're in a generally safe environment, you might prioritize a less disruptive device over a high sensitivity. And so what we wanted to do, at least in theory, is really giving the control of their own fate and their alarm system back into the patient's hands. But we're not maximizing sensitivity anymore. So there go all of our assumptions. Having said that, we learned a lot along the way of how to make assumptions better next time. Now, as far as results go for this, these are our 10 patients that we dealt with. We had data for about 2 to 3 years for every patient. We trained every network specifically for one patient. Number of seizures ranged between, I think, for one patient it was 4 seizures over the course of 2 years. Another patient had, I think, 80 seizures a month, and so they were quite variable. And we managed to at least be better than chance for all of them, but to various degrees. And truth is, we don't really know why, because it's deep learning and we can't really interpret those results very well. We're also able to have this adjustable piece in there, so we can, for each of the patients, at least again in simulation, we can say what if we prioritize sensitivity over time and warning. And so what these bars show is that green is sensitivity, red is time and warning, that if we prioritize one over the other, those bars shrink and grow. So you can actually, for the same patient, adjust that algorithm a little bit. So now what? We learned a lot of things doing this. We know that there is some difference between the normal brain state and the brain state before a seizure is happening. We don't know what that is, and we also don't know if that is very different across patients, or if there are variables that we hadn't accounted for, like seizures happen in different parts of the brain. Is that important, for example? There are different types of seizures. How important is that? We don't really know what that is, but we can, at least to a certain extent, predict that despite having very, very messy data. We also learned that the domain knowledge is invaluable because we went in very, is it blue-eyed, is that the term? Very much looking at it as a data science problem without really accounting for the domain that it came from. So knowing that seizures go together with some sort of change in synchronization was good because we could use spectrograms over, for example, RNNs. Now knowing that patients are that seizures are like highly patient-specific, we went through a lot of iterations where we thought we'd just dump all the data into one bucket and it's clearly going to get better, or we train on 5 people and then test on person number 6, and none of that worked. So we really need to, with these things, be very patient-specific. And then another thing that kind of took some time to realize is that the signals are changing over time, and that more data isn't always better depending on, I guess, what domain you're in. And we were lucky enough to have a lot of feedback with neurologists as well, who would tell us that tunability is something that's necessary for patients to be able to use something like that. Another thing I think that's important to mention is that we also have to be really, really careful when we talk about machine learning in general, and I think there's going to be a talk later on that as well. Often, it's I don't want to like point fingers, but it can be the fault of the scientists, it can be the fault of the media, or of how you interpret these results. But I think often people take this as the truth. So you make a model, you say it's 80% accurate, and someone hears, oh yeah, that's more than 50, right? So it works all the time. So we have to be really, really careful, especially if it gets to communities where what we do is like the hope for an improved life, or being seizure-free, or being more able to go through your day without the expectation of having a seizure. At the moment, we're working on seizure detection, so we've actually gone a step back. And I think it was this morning, when someone said in industry, it's not important if you're like 5% better or not, right? We found that that's very much not true for this field. So the people in academia that we talked to at the very start, they're like, oh yeah, seizure detection, that's solved, like we've all done that. It works, it's okay. And then we started talking to neurologists, and they're like, yeah, it's not good enough, we can't use it. And so there is this gap, at least for this specific case, where it's like, it's a giant gap between science thinks it's solved and neurologists thinks it's useful. And so we're trying to close that at the moment. So that's only seizure detection, and it also doesn't mean we have to drill into people's brains for that, because it can be done with caps alone, and in that case, we actually also have a much, much bigger pool of data, so we can potentially group people into useful little subgroups. Thank you for listening. I know this was different. These are my wonderful colleagues that I work with and that have put their heart and soul into this work as well.
Great, thank you very much.